Hi, I'm Claudia Newton. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama, and I'm here on behalf of the Smocking Arts Guild of America today to talk with you about stem stitch and outline stitch. Both of these stitches are worked similarly. They are a small row of straight stitches that slightly overlap each other and work along our design lines. To start, if you're a right-handed stitcher, tie on and then bring the thread in at the left end of your design line. This is a large thread, so I'm going to make these stitches pretty big, about 1/4 of an inch. I'll take the needle down for my first stitch, but before I pull the thread through, I want to bring the needle back out because remember these overlap. I'm going to overlap them by 1/2, which is the way we like to do it for heirloom work, and then I can pull it through. That starts my second stitch now. I'm working stem stitch at this point, so I want to drop the thread back down below the line. I'm going to keep it below the needle and below the line at all times. I move forward now about 1/4 of an inch for my next stitch. Then I bring it out again on the design line, halfway back, which means that it's going to share a hole. Draw it down snug to the fabric. Drop the thread down again because again it's stem stitch. Go in about 1/4 of an inch, come back out in that shared hole to start my next stitch before I snug this one down. So stem stitch always keeps the thread below the design line, below the needle. Now we'll do outline stitch and exactly the same stitch, but this time I keep the thread above the line. Before I pull it down, bring it back out into that shared hole, and that makes outline stitch. Outline stitch keeps the thread above the needle, above the line. I move forward about 1/4 of an inch. Again, bring it back out in the shared hole and snug the thread down. And that's the difference in the two. Stem stitch keeps the thread always below the needle, below the design line, and with outline stitch you have the thread above the design line, above the needle. If you look where I started, you can see that there's a little thin thread out there that leaves a gap by itself. Back here, as I progress, these stitches overlapped, and you can see that I've got a double layer of thread there and it looks thicker. Here where there was no overlap, it leaves a skinny little end to it that's not very attractive. So let me show you how we fix that. Instead of taking that big 1/4 inch stitch that I took the first time, I'm going to take a short stitch this time. So less than 1/4. And instead of going halfway back to the starting point, I'm going to go almost all the way back to the end of that line and draw this through. At this point now, after the first stitch, I'm ready to stitch normally. So I go ahead 1/4. I come back out in that shared hole and continue then with my 1/4 inch stitches like I did before. What that does is to create a taper to the end so that you don't see that skinny gap there anymore. We fill that in. You can do a similar technique at the end of the line so that you don't have a long thread hanging out there either. What happens then is, again, this is outline stitch. I would take this last stitch from here that would go to the end of the line. I take it a couple of threads inside the end of that design line. I bring the next one up in the hole to overlap it. And now when I finish, this stitch comes just a thread or two outside, beyond the other one. And there again, that fills in that gap, so I don't have a long skinny thread out there with no overlap to it. When you get ready to change a thread, if this is the last stitch that I can work with my old thread, I take the needle to the back, just as if I were going to make that stitch. I'll take it back, but instead of bringing it up in the hole now, I don't have enough thread to make that stitch. I just on the surface. Get it out of my way. Tie on with a new thread, and the new thread is the one that comes up inside the hole to start the next stitch. And I can pull this one snug now, just like I normally would if there was still a needle on it. This one is ready to stitch with, so I keep it in the correct position, up or down. Overlap it. and continue stitching with the new thread. If I want to stitch without a hoop, I use a finger shield. That way I don't stick myself and the needle runs more smoothly through the fabric. When you use a finger shield, you need to roll the fabric over your finger, and you want tension on the fabric to go along a grain direction, either a vertical straight grain or a sideways grain, but never on the bias because that'll stretch and pucker your embroidery. To work in a hoop, without a hoop, we'll do the same thing. I enter at the end of the stitch and bring the needle right back out, this time in that same hole, so that I'm doing that in and out process all in one motion. When we work in a hoop, we call it a stab stitch because we stab down and stab back up. When we work in hand, we call it a scoop stitch because we scoop the needle in and right back out all in one motion. I've got the thread above because I'm doing outline stitch again, and I'll scoop that one more time so you can see. You just stick in, back out, and that's the way you stitch it. Now, when you do these curves, you want to make the stitches slightly shorter than what you do on a straight line. Because if you're not careful, if I stitch this too far out and make a big stitch, it'll start to make points on the edge and you'll have a jagged edge rather than a smooth curve. So the trick to doing a curve is to remember the needle always enters and always exits on the design line. That preserves the shape of the curve, and you want to shorten the stitch so that you get a nice smooth curve rather than a jagged edge. I have a sample here. This little day gown has stem stitch for the vines on the skirt and on the top of it. If you look, you've also got some little satin stitch leaves and French knot flowers. So it doesn't take a whole lot of stitches to make a pretty design. So think about how you can use stem stitch on your next project, and thank you for watching.